You're listening to Halfway There, episode number 165, Steve Bremner and God Outside the Box. This one gets wild. Well, hey friends, welcome to Halfway There. This is the show where we have honest conversations with ordinary Christians about today's Christian experience. I can't wait to share this episode with you. Of course, I'm your host, Eric Nevins, and I'm glad that you are here. So today, our guest, he is an author, a sometime podcaster, and Supreme Galactic Emperor. I'll ask him about that. He is Steve Bremner. Steve, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Eric.
I'm glad that you're here.
And for addressing me by my correct name.
Do people get it wrong?
I've never asked anyone to call me that before. It's the first time on the form for
Fantastic. Well, yeah. So just friends, what I'm letting you in on there is I have a little form that podcast guests fill out so that I can collect all their information and be ready, not have to send them a million emails later. Learned that one the hard way. And Steve, I said, how would you like me to address you or introduce you? And he said, Supreme Galactic Emperor. So you got a sense of humor, which will be fun to talk about as we go forward. So, Steve, why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are and where you are now?
Okay. So that sounds like a simple question, but it's actually pretty daunting for me.
Okay.
I've been here, like to specifically answer where I'm at now. So I've been here in Peru for the last 10 years, more than 10. And, you know, what I find myself doing now is a lot different than whatever vision I had, whatever I was doing when I first came here as a single man at the end of my 20s in the beginning, right?
Yeah.
Now a lot of my focus is more on the tent making aspect of funding my ministry than it is the ministry itself, it seems. And the main thing I'm giving a lot of my attention and time to has to do with helping, authors write their books, or, busy entrepreneurs or thought leaders of some kind who are looking for expert status, that a book can bring them, as well as other people like pastors or people who have a impacting message. So a lot of what I'm doing is really through that lens right now. But we're still down here in Peru. We're still a part of our organic missional community, organic church, whatever, the buzzwords are, called Oikos. And, my wife and I are still involved in that, just on a smaller scale. And we've been a part of it for 7 years, almost. Yeah, it's got to be about 7 years now. And so I don't know whether to call what I'm doing now a sabbatical or not, but that's where I'm at now.
Awesome. Well, that's great. So how you got there will be an interesting story, I think. So I can't wait to hear it. So let's go back a little bit. Where are you from? So you're in Peru now, which I think is cool. I love the fact that we can, through technology, not only meet, but also have this conversation. That's fantastic. But where'd you grow up?
I grew up in this small town, you've never heard of it, Ontario, called Peterborough. And it's in the middle of like cottage country. All sorts of hockey players come from where I grew up. And I lived a very sheltered life, didn't really visit or live anywhere else other than that city.
What was your family like? Was it a Christian family? Was it not? I mean, how did you kind of find life in Christ?
Well, I went to church on Sundays. That's true. I would say like my family were more of the nominal faith. My parents would take my brother and I to church every Sunday. We were in Sunday school and stuff. And then when I was old enough, I was obligated to go to youth group on Friday nights and stuff. My dad, I don't think he's so much following, now, but my mom, she's always been a faithful believer. And then sometime when I was like 15, I really gave my life to Christ for real.
So tell us that story. Like, what happened?
I don't remember the exact details. I just know, okay, this is it. Like whatever I was doing before was not the real thing. And so I was around 15 and I had whatever, issues. I had insecurity and self esteem issues or whatever. And so there was this day or week where I was rushing home from delivering my newspapers, and I decided, okay, I'm done with like horoscopes and other things that like I want some kind of answers from and be able to kind of predict the future or see what's coming tomorrow or next week or whatever in my life. And these Christians, they seem to be pretty happy people. And okay, I'll read the Bible and maybe God will do for me what I want or something.
Yeah.
So I started like I grabbed my Bible one night. This was in the middle of March 1997, and it was on like spring break or March break, depending on which country you're using. And I opened in the middle of somewhere in the Psalms, and I read to the end, and then I read like Proverbs, and then went back to like the beginning of Psalms or something. Or if I didn't read Proverbs, I can't remember, but I spent like 5 hours doing that. I read like all the Psalms from the point I started at to the end, and then went back to the beginning up to where I'd read from. And I was like, wow, this is not a boring book at all. This is amazing. Or, whatever life it was I was getting out of it. So I kept like doing that. I would just open up something, it could be a gospel. It could be some random book. I didn't know in those days how to read the Bible. So I would just open it to things.
Right.
And I was just loving it. And, so somewhere in there, I was like, okay, I'll give myself to this for real, not just like a insurance policy to get out of hell or something.
Right.
And so that's kind of like, I don't have this kind of, I was trembling at the altar and weeping my soul out. And it was just this odd thing like that. Like I'd been around the gospel a lot already for years, but I know that I had no commitment whatsoever to Christ until 15, until that happened.
Yeah. And all of a sudden it clicked, it sounds like.
Yeah. You could say it that way if you want. It clicked when I was 15. There
you go. Yeah, that's good. I don't know. I think of it as kind of a continuum. We sort of are moving closer to God, and then there's a point at which we kind of realize where we're headed. And so it sounds like that was for you around 15, which is cool. That's I love to hear different kinds of stories like that. So where did that take you? And did you have people who invested in you to disciple you, or eventually that takes you to the Fire School of Ministry? But how did you get there? Fill that in for us.
Well, yeah, I guess around the time that I gave my life to Christ, we had this new youth pastor who'd started that year, my 10th grade of high school. And on some level I was getting, discipled, but maybe not like 100% personally by him, like one-on-one, but, going to the youth group and being a part of what was going on, attending everything that I could. And in those high school years, I found out about like a Christian group at school. And so I would, avail myself of that and make those friendships and stuff with people. But as far as like anyone that I could pinpoint and say this person was actively discipling me, I wouldn't have known what that is at the time.
Yeah.
So I'm probably going to lean more towards no, as far as like one-on-one or personal, but I was definitely in very healthy atmosphere for, growing in my faith.
You ended up feeling called to ministry apparently at some point.
Right.
So how'd that happen?
Yeah, I just wanted to get into like youth ministry or something, because like I was a youth and so I didn't know anything else. But like I knew I love studying the word. I want to teach it to people. I want to make other people understand it and get it and whatever easier. Some people would have told you I was like an evangelist, but I didn't really think I was, and I still don't. But I think that like I just look at, there's this psalm that says, I teach transgressors the ways of the Lord. And so it's whether they already know they're a transgressor or not, but like if somebody's not saved or somebody's a believer, I wanted to make them get the word. And so I was always bringing like high school friends to youth group or, trying to evangelize and stuff. And it felt to me like, why don't other people want to do this too? There was, and so like, I didn't feel like I was evangelistic, but just more like, just in love with Jesus and wanting to share this with everybody possible. And then, eventually some of the friends I made towards the end of high school were more Pentecostal, charismatic type of people, you know, the happy clappies, and just different, just, you know, I thought Christians were weird in general, but like then these guys were even weirder. And
I'd rather be a happy clappy than a frozen chosen any day.
Same here. But like in those days, I didn't fully know the difference, like what this denomination is or what that one believes or whatever. Like to me, it was like, why are there denominations? I don't get this. And I didn't, you know, I knew there was like Catholics, but what are we? You know, what am I? What is this church? You know? And eventually I found out we're Plymouth Brethren. But anyway, long story made short, for details that aren't necessary, you know, I made these new friends, and several of them would carpool and go to Brownsville in Pensacola, right?
Oh,
so I think like two or three times there was like a caravan that took a, you know, trip down to Pensacola for a week or something. And maybe like at least one of them, perhaps two of those trips, I was really kind of like jealous that I didn't get to go or nobody asked me or whatever. And so those guys would always bring back buttloads of tapes, you know, VHS tapes in those days. Yeah. And I would borrow them. I'd, you know, copy them and have my own copies to watch and stuff. And I was just devouring this stuff. And it was like unlike anything else I'd heard or, you know, listened to up to that point. And so I kind of decided, well, then, you know, I want to go to this Bible school if these are the teachers and, you know, these are the things they're teaching. And it's supposedly, in those days, it was non-denominational. So I didn't have to worry of like, I was worried if I go to a Bible college, then it's geared towards like getting you fit for ministry in their denomination or something. And I was like, I viewed that as very limiting as an 18, 19-year-old because I didn't know what I wanted to do or necessarily, but get into ministry somehow. And Brownsville School of Ministry at the time was non-denominational in theory. And then there was that whole split, and then Fire School started and whatever. So in the end, I went to Fire just from, you know, I could trace it back to people I met in high school who were on fire. And, you know, we'd get up at like 6:30 a.m. and go to a lecture room at a Bible college near my high school. And, you know, I didn't make it every day of the week. I was not disciplined in that regard, but they would be praying at 6:30 every morning for revival in our hometown, like what was going on down there in Pensacola. And, you know, so like when you're around people who are, let's call them on fire, you know, when you're around people that are on fire or more so than you are, like you catch that at least.
Yeah.
Or you could ignore it and try to stay frozen or whatever. But for me, it was like, okay, you know, I gotta go down this path. And, you know, it eventually led me to go into that Bible college. And
I'm finding that connection really intriguing because Ontario and Pensacola or Brownsville, they're not very close. Like that's fascinating that drew you, but it sounds like the passion for the Lord was really attractive to you.
Right. I would say that even if at the time I might not have vocalized it that way. Sure. But it was definitely the passion. It was definitely, you know, not just being an institution for getting you to, you know the Bible and become some kind of pastor or, you know, worship leader or whatever, the few things that you can become if you go to, you know, Bible school or something. Right. You know, man. The few things that I thought or knew that there were to become if I go to Bible college at the time. And, you know, their thing, you know, I don't want to say their shtick, but the revival, you know, being in that revival, being, you know, all about raising people up and sending them to the world as missionaries and stuff. Yeah. That was appealing to me. Not the going and being a missionary thing. I never thought I would. But I knew I'm going to get something out of this and come away and have a better idea of like whatever the next step for life is, you know, and yeah, I loved it. Yeah. Obviously.
Interesting. So I think you're the second person I've had on the show who was impacted by the Brownsville revival. Specifically, which is interesting to me because I can see one of the things I love about doing this is it's honest conversations with ordinary Christians about today's Christian experience, right? So I'm trying to do what are people actually experiencing in the 21st century with God? And so I see these different movements like the campus crusade or crew, different camps people give their life to Christ at. Billy Graham comes up more often than I would have thought. Right. And now Brownsville more than once. So I think that's fascinating, kind of how, it just gives me a fascinating picture of what God's doing, maybe, or just kind of different waves in the same ocean, which I don't know. I'll have to think about that metaphor and see if I like it, but
sure.
Anyway, that's, so fascinating. All right. So you go to the fire school, so this is kind of a charismatic movement, right? So how did that play into kind of your experience?
Oh, like the most obvious thing, coming out of Plymouth Brethren is, the Brethren don't believe in gifts of the Spirit.
Yeah.
Don't believe in tongues or the baptism or these things. And I remember for like a year or two before finally going to Brownsville, because like it was my last year of high school that I was watching these videos and hanging out with my friend who I went down there with. And then a year off after high school, and so he could, graduate and whatever. It just worked out this way. So it was like 2 years of really being kind of surrounded by things related to gifts of the Holy Spirit and things that were outside of my zone of understanding in my home church. And so when I went, I remember having like, not an argument, but this kind of conversation with him one time, because I was tired of people praying for me to receive the gift of tongues and stuff, and was so like, I'm fine the way I am, or whatever thoughts I had. And he said to me something like, well, you better let them know, that since they've accepted you to come to their school, you better let them know you don't believe in speaking in tongues, or, something like that. That I'm like, oh no, what's like, I don't know. In hindsight, it's hard for me to really remember what it felt like, but I remember being scared of like, if I do go to a Pentecostal charismatic Bible college, like, will there be something wrong with me? Will I be deficient? Will there be something, and nobody really ever put that feeling on me, which is important to note in hindsight. But like other brethren, other people would tell me that's what like Pentecostals believe and feel and think and whatever. So I had this kind of insecurity and fear, but nobody cared. Nobody made a deal of it, And so when I went down in August, the end of August 2001, you might remember, if you've not been in a coma for the last 20 years, that 9/11 happened in the weeks. Yeah, Sorry. The weeks that happened and the weeks that followed. And I remember it was September 9th, that it was a Sunday night, and at church, the fire church, the preacher was sharing on, Acts chapter 2, because that's all that Pentecost preaching, right? And
is Acts
and he, he's sharing this thing about Acts chapter 2,
right?
And he said this thing like, blood and vapors of smoke. And he goes, can you imagine if our meetings had, blood and smoke, that'll make them talk about you then. Ooh. And it was just this weird kind of, wow, I've seen that in the text before, but never really kind of, there's things we kind of turn off our brain when we read in the Bible, because it just kind of, we don't experience or whatever. And I just remember that message being powerful. And at the end, he asked if there's anyone who wanted to give their lives to Christ. A bunch of people went forward. And then if there's anyone there that wanted to be baptized in the Holy Spirit, and I didn't raise my hand, I didn't do nothing. But like, I look around me and there's like 200 fingers pointing in my direction, like at me, like I'm being singled out. So I'm like, fine. I get up and I go forward, and like, people pray for me. And that night I was like speaking in tongues for the first time, and shocked at how easy it was. And it wasn't this complicated, whatever these ideas I had up to that point. And then that was it. Right. Well, the next day was the 10th. The Monday was a day off. And then, the Tuesday was September 11th. And I remember getting to school early, and, the sanctuary was filled with people praying and interceding. And I remember having no idea what to pray, like that verse says, like, I don't know what we're supposed to do, what's going on. And in the early morning, maybe people had heard the name Bin Laden, but like it wasn't clear yet, like who was doing what and
right.
why and whatever, right? And I just remember like it just flowed, I had no idea what to pray, but here now, like, okay, I'll just like intercede in tongues and whatever. And so like in the first weeks of school, like it's already a radically different experience than anything I'd ever had growing up in like a Plymouth Brethren atmosphere. It was definitely like a night and day difference from the type of Christianity I'd grown up with. And yeah.
Yeah, no, that is a huge transition. So I'm interested in the fact that you weren't afraid of it. Like that's pretty cool. Or you were a little bit, but then you were like, okay, I'm gonna go anyway. And that's fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah. I had misgivings and misconceptions. Sure.
Right.
That in hindsight are just silly to me, but like meeting, actually interacting with people and knowing them and having a few friends in my life and spending a lot of time in prayer with people, that help make it not a matter of denominations and doctrines and whatever, but like knowing people and seeing how they were living their lives. But like, it took a while for some things to change my thinking. And, you pack up and you go to another country, because people, might already know this, but like Canada is a different country than the United States.
We just think of it as like the 51st state. We're like, whatever.
Yeah. I've noticed people think that.
And Mexico.
But like, but you pack up and you go to another country for another denomination or another flavor of like Christianity, like that Bible school.
Mm-hmm.
So the culture, like Pensacola, Florida, for all intents and purposes, is Alabama.
Yeah.
So to go from like Ontario to Alabama, I had more culture shock that first month in Alabama than I ever did in Europe or South America, because I wasn't anticipating it, wasn't expecting it. I didn't realize just how different our cultures are. And then, 9/11 of all things happening in those first weeks of, I'm living on my own. I've gone away to another country, another, Bible school and stuff. So there's all these things where that was like setting a precedent for adulthood,
Yeah. So that can be very disorienting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. Wow. Okay. So you're kind of learning there. You're figuring it out. So did that happen? So you spoke in tongues within the first month? Is that what you said? Like that just.
Yeah.
Interesting.
September 9th.
You're like, okay.
Easy to remember because of, the events that week.
Of course. But it's kind of interesting that was like an early experience. It didn't take very long for you to kind of dive in. Okay. So obviously if you went there, like you were kind of in on kind of the movement and, what God was doing there. What is something that you learned that maybe, and maybe tongues is it, that's okay if it is, but that maybe other people don't know, just kind of looking from the outside? Because revival gets a little bit scary.
Right. Well, I went when it was over or
afterwards.
The split had happened. Yeah, I believe it was like over. But when you're there, people who were going there, didn't feel that way. But as far as like, when the school had started, that split had happened after, most people agreed or believed it had ended. And so I felt like I was there more for like the aftermath of it than the actual revival. Oh, but there's plenty. Like I still, because it was so soon after it had, kind of waned or whatever, I believe and feel like I got a lot of the benefit or the, I don't know, anointing or some kind of thing from it. Like there's things I've unlearned too. I'm not, I didn't just, take everything I got out of that experience. But I think one of the things that it used to kind of bug me a little bit that like outsiders would say, and I would feel like, well, that's definitely not true, I can vouch otherwise, was, some of the flakier manifestation nonsense or whatever, that like now we would say like a viral video or something out of context that becomes, well known, little things like that. But I probably, like one of the things I've unlearned is I probably got really legalistic from this atmosphere where there's a strong desire for personal holiness and corporate holiness. And, in hindsight, things that I was like scared I'm going to get myself kicked out of school or something. But like in hindsight, the pastoral leaders would never have cared about. But like, as a young sheep with other dumb sheep, you kind of come up with on your own, and assume everybody lives the same way and whatever. But I remember like in my second semester being so scared I was going to be kicked out of school, and not because anyone in leadership or anything made me feel that way. And in hindsight, I see how tender my conscience got in that type of atmosphere. And so, whatever kind of accusations I might hear about them not being focused on like Jesus or the cross or things like that are, they were a bit laughable to me whenever I'd hear those things.
Yeah.
Because I'm like, they have a strong focus on these things,
Right.
So much so that like the counter effect is some, legalism.
Right. Yeah. And you know what? I'm not even convinced that usually the people who say, oh, you have to focus on the cross are way too focused on sin, to be honest. That our focus shouldn't be on sin. It should be on Jesus and on the freedom that he's given
Amen.
us. So that's how I feel about it. But yeah, interesting. I also have this sort of, I'm trying to think of the right word, like interesting relationship with the idea of having a sensitivity toward holiness. Like I think obviously it's important. It is good. And there's seasons when we go through that, and it's good for us to make those decisions where we go, okay, I'm going to do these things. I one time destroyed all of my secular music, because we had to, get rid of that. But now,
So
right. Cause that was sort of how I felt. And it was a good thing for me to decide, hey, I am going to follow Jesus, and I really need to just only have those influences right now. Later, as a more mature person, it made sense I brought some of that back, right? And I don't think that's backsliding. I think that's maturity. I think there's a difference.
Sure.
And so that...
I agree. Yeah. So like, I feel the same way when I am glad as a 16-year-old or whatever that I got rid of all my secular music. And I don't necessarily recommend you get saved, you have to get rid of your music. But like, I know how immature I was and what influence some of my, negative music was when I got saved. And I remember when I was 16, the second Foo Fighters album came out, and they were playing in Toronto, and I had not yet really thought of getting rid of my secular music yet. But a couple of friends of mine and I, we went and saw Foo Fighters, this band called Talk Show, who were Stone Temple Pilots, but the singer was in rehab, and so they got a new singer and changed their name or whatever. And then these two other Canadian bands, Treble Charger and Rusty. But particularly I went to see Foo Fighters, right? And I remember, I'm 6 months old in the Lord. We took a ride down with my friend's dad, and he just picked on me and was like, trying to get a reaction out of me and all this kind of stuff. The whole ride there, just making fun of the Bible, making fun of, Jesus and stuff. And like, thinking I'm some kind of fool and whatever. So while we're there I remember at the concert having this conviction hit me, like I shouldn't be here, like this is not the type of place I should be. And I had this like worry that what if like the rapture happens today, right now?
Right.
And for like all of eternity, my story is I was at a Foo Fighters concert when it happened.
Right.
Which is, you're laughing, and it is laughable now.
Because I've had those thoughts. I've done that too. Yeah.
And so I was, 16, immature and all that kind of stuff. And, and this is, like 10,000 people crammed into like an old airport or whatever the place was. Or, maybe the audience was bigger. I don't know. But I mean, it was not a Christian concert where there's like hundreds of people, but like a real concert,
right.
And but not like this stadium. And in hindsight, that my maturity level was such that that's not a place I really should have been. But now, I've got notifications on Facebook. The instant those guys come to Peru again, I'm gonna go.
Right.
Like it's a little bit different now at my age and my maturity and whatever. So
yeah, well, I think so. I love to talk about the spiritual journey. I think that's an important point, right? Like, it's okay. So we have to be sensitive for people who have those sensitive consciences, and that they're in that season, and they need to make those decisions to follow the Lord in certain ways, and not be necessarily limited for them by them as well ourselves, because we may be in a different place. And it might be okay. Like Paul could eat the meat offered to idols, right? And go, that's nothing, right? Not everybody could do that. And I think we have to just take that into account. So sometimes people struggle with it. All right. So that's really fascinating. Thanks for going into some of that, because I agree. And I'm just really interested in sort of how things like the effects of Brownsville did, influence people. So it's interesting to hear that from you. Incidentally, I'm just going to throw this in there. So, talking about manifestations and things like that. My favorite thing that I learned in seminary when I went to Trinity, did a church history class, and we read Jonathan Edwards' book on revival, which of all people, you would think Jonathan Edwards, he's like a Puritan and he's very, would be very reformed and very buttoned down, you would think. And he had people like barking at his things and falling down at his preaching, things like that. And people asked him to write about it. He wrote about it. And his thought was basically, hey, it might be the Holy Spirit, and so I'm not going to stop it, which I thought was really a fascinating response from a Puritan. So,
right. This book I just showed you, I know this is audio and people aren't going to listen. It's like the old copy of Dr. Brown's From Holy Laughter to Holy Fire book.
Yeah.
Which I guess he wrote and published right before like he had even heard about the revival. And he's got this section on those non-signs of Jonathan Edwards. I think there's like 9 of them. And, like this happening is not evidence the Holy Spirit is here, nor is it evidence that it's not, like that he's not. Like I forget the exact wording of them. I just whipped this off my shelf now, right?
Yeah.
But like you look at the fruit and you look at stuff like that. And I'm the type of person who, non-signs, he called them, right? As far as physical manifestations were one of the key ones. I've always been comfortable. Like I don't care when manifestations happen because I had that laid in me that they're not a sign in and of themselves necessarily, right? Like somebody could come here and shake, bake, and rattle and roll and then go home and they're still like living in sin or something. So that's, not the outward that I'm going to look for. And,
right.
Funny thing about manifestations, 2 things, if you'll indulge me.
Sure.
One was that friend of mine, that charismatic who, when I was like not Pentecostal or whatever yet, like he used to make up like jokes to try to like, knock me off my stride and put some, friendly fear in me about like what fire was going to be like. And he tried telling me there would be this manifestation class where they teach you how to manifest, and that, on command, if somebody came up to you in a service and said, manifest, that you could. And I'm like, well, then I'm going to fail that class. Like, I just remember being like, and it was a joke. He's trying to, get me fearful that, something will happen that won't and whatever. And then the other thing is with manifestations, I don't know how many people I've prayed for in altar settings where nothing happens, they don't fall. And I remember one time standing in the front with leaders or whatever was going on. And I'm praying for people and boom, I'm done praying for them and next person. And I watched this lady say like to this other lady, no, nothing happens when he prays. Go over here. And they went to like somebody else who, everybody was like shaking. And I was like, well,
weird.
What are you looking for?
Right.
Like that bothered me because, I was more insecure about it then than now. And so I'd be in meetings where they say like, this guy will, catch for you. And for the listener who doesn't know what a catcher is, that's where it's like a type of usher or whatever, where they're behind the person that you're praying for, just in case they fall down, or they fall down and their belly or their bum or whatever is showing, and they might have a blanket to cover them and whatever. And I would say like, no, I don't need any catchers. People don't really, nothing really happens when I pray for people. And I didn't mean that in like a self-doubt kind of way or anything. I was just more like, there's just so few people, maybe you go where you see the need more than being near me. And I kid you not, Eric, every single person, they would just drop like potatoes, like I'm like hugging, like if it's a guy, like I'm kind of like hugging him before he falls down to the ground and, laying him down gently and stuff. And I'm like, okay, God, like I don't get it. Like normally nothing happens. And then now like everything is happening.
Yeah.
And,
what do you make of that?
Well, I think God doesn't have a box that he works in, and, he doesn't do things to like our expectations and our minds. Because I remember one time being at Brownsville on a Friday night to hear Tommy Tenney speak. And he was, at the end, he's going around laying hands on people, praying for people. And I'm watching everyone just fall to the ground and whatever. And so, there's this moment when he's coming my way and lays hands on my head or whatever, and 30 seconds go by and then he moves on. And I'm standing there, and I remember feeling like, you know, because I'm like 20, 21 or whatever still. Oh man, that sucked. You know, like what a ripoff. Nothing happened to me, and everybody else is falling and shaking, and it looks like they're having a good time. So I turn around, and then like, I don't know, I walk by like 6 or 7 people, and as soon as I get like near them, each one of them just falls to the floor, and I'm not feeling anything. There's no whatever going on. And I'm like, you know, not affected by whatever's affecting them, even though it's like when they're in my vicinity. It's so like I learned early on that this stuff doesn't mean, you know, something's happening for someone, you know, if it, you know, it's not impacting them unless they manifest or look a certain way or behave a certain way or whatever. Nor does somebody, maybe if it doesn't happen to them, you know, it doesn't mean God didn't do something mighty and powerful inside them. So,
right.
Anyway, that's just to tag on your thing about Jonathan Edwards and what you wouldn't expect him.
Yeah,
that's where
that totally fascinated me. Here's what I want to take from that, and I just want to apply this, guys. So, here's the thing: a lot of us are perhaps more distant from the charismatic movement, groups, churches, because we look at that and we see physical manifestations, and we're afraid. Here's the thing: don't be afraid. Like, God is bigger. God is, and there. I love Richard Foster's book. I'll put a link to that in the show notes about, I forget what it's called, even streams. Like, he has this idea of streams, right? And charismatic is one of them. And so don't be afraid to explore it. Take your relationship with God there and listen and see what happens. Observe. You don't have to fall down. You don't have to do whatever, but ask God if he might be calling you into something like that. Or into a different kind of experience. It's okay. It's okay. And you don't have to be afraid. Anyway, I wanted to call out that fear, because I think so many of us miss something because we're afraid.
Giver.
Yeah. So where'd you go? So you eventually you started to tell us the story. You ended up going to Amsterdam, right? And that, Rotterdam. So you wanted to be a missionary. How did you make that decision? And then tell us that story.
So in my second semester, there was a group of fire grads who went and formed a base in Holland. And they came back at least once that semester to basically share all the fruit, share everything they were seeing going on. You know, they were going into high schools and like having assemblies and preaching the gospel and seeing people get saved. And you know, they mentioned how they needed people to come and make disciples. You know, they had no problem with like the evangelism and people who were called to evangelize and stuff, but they needed, you know, people to plant and water, you know, what was planted and stuff. And so I remember going up and talking to the guy. His name is Greg Montella. He's actually somebody you ought to interview on your podcast. I'll try to hook you guys up.
That'd be great.
And he's basically doing like the equivalent of like 50 missionaries with all the things he does. But anyway, this is about me. And so he had this team there, and they were, you know, I stayed in touch with him. I talked to him every time he was in town about whatever was going on in Holland. And this is before social media. This is before, you know, I knew what a blog was or things. So really you hear like minimally whatever's going on around the world, unless you're on someone's newsletter list or whatever in those days.
Oh yeah. Back in the day, wasn't that crazy?
Anyway. Yeah. In hindsight, it's so it took me like 3 years after that before I finally set foot over there, because I finished school and then fire changed from 2 years to 3 years, and I went and started my third year but never finished it. Just graduated the 2-year diploma thing. Well, I remember I went over there to do an internship in like spring of 2005. And so like I came back to Canada, raised money, and became, you know, affiliated with Fire and a thing in Canada called Calvary International Canada for my support raising and stuff. And, you know, probably a year after I'd left that trip, I'd moved back as a missionary, and I was there for about a year and a half. But when I first moved there, I thought, oh, we're going to bring revival. We're going to see this, you know, Jesus revolution and things that like we'd learned in Bible school, like whether arrogantly or naively, you know, as a young person, like fresh out of Bible school, like that's the kind of vision and expectation I had for what I'm going to go do there. And obviously it didn't happen, or at least, whatever, God's doing in that nation is not like because of me or something, and,
yeah, there's an interesting mix there, isn't there? Of both naivete and arrogance, which is sort of the blessing of the young, I think.
Yeah. And in hindsight, as a young missionary, it was hard to raise support. So I'd do floors with my leader. He would take me with him because his full-time job was doing like wood floors. And so I spend a lot of time, and I would say like, that time was discipling for me, and spending time doing a trade, appreciating aspects of ministry where people are full-time and don't, they're not bivocational and don't need to tent make and whatever. Because just that kind of physical labor was not my cup of tea if it didn't have to be.
Yeah.
And but I did like having money because I like food and shelter and stuff.
Right.
And,
Me too.
So anyway, he had a cafe he had opened in a Muslim neighborhood, and the idea was to be open a few nights of the week, and just there was board games, there was couches, and like a fake bar, like a non-alcoholic type of bar.
Right.
And we were, we had very few volunteers, so we were only open a few nights of the week. And then that kind of transitioned into more of like a house of prayer type of ministry where we would, be doing prayer events and stuff like that all the time. But for various reasons, I didn't, I didn't last. I think I maybe spent a year there. And around that time, I don't know if you want me to go into it or not, but that's when
Well, what I'm interested in is, because I know that you had a... I mean, maybe this wasn't a full-scale dark night of the soul. I guess you can tell me what that was like. But I know it was kind of discouraging to you, and so you kind of had to go wrestle with, God, what are you doing here? Where are you actually taking me? So tell us kind of that aspect of the story.
Well, I feel like I've had a few of those, but the one that would be for that season or that aspect of my ministry was, there was wondering if I had missed God and just presumptively went over to the Netherlands that second time or not, in light of how, like, previously that other team packed up and moved to the States and stuff. I felt like, what if I wasn't really supposed to come? Maybe that's why, the fruit looks the way it does, or the things are difficult and don't seem to, be improving, or there's all sorts of questions I had like that. But I went back to Canada. Every fall, Fire has like a mission conference. So I'd gone to that in North Carolina. Went back to Canada and was just not in a position to head back over to the Netherlands yet. I didn't do anything, I didn't raise any new support or whatever. And it's, costly to live in Europe. And so I remember my pastor was on a trip to Peru. And this is I long since left the Brethren Church. This is like a non-denominational charismatic church I've been a part of for a few years now. So he's on a trip to Peru. He comes back. I meet with him, and he's asking me about how I'm doing in Holland. What's my life like? What's my week like? Any girls, whatever. And then when I'm done, he just kind of tells me, you don't believe what you're telling me, Steve. And I was like, what do you mean? What did I say that you saw through? Or, what's the old people hack that you've got that you've caught something that I don't realize I'm doing or whatever? I didn't say it that way, but anyway. And he's like, well, is like something wrong? Or you having a hard time over there? Do you enjoy what you're doing or whatever? And so I told him, like, okay. So I told him honestly how things were going. I told him some of the fights I had with my leader. I told him some of the weekly or monthly kind of, feelings of not accomplishing anything, not producing any fruit, whatever. And so he recommended postponing my trip back until after I could go on a trip with him to Peru, which I did. And then that trip was 6 weeks the next spring. And I came with him. He was there the first 10 days, and he hooked me up with different places he was preaching in, where every one of them, their youth group invited me to come, speak to their youth or whatever. But when I left his office that day, I remember walking down the hall from his office feeling like Peru is the next place I'm going to live, And so having that thing to focus on helped get through that dark night of the soul, kind of like that discouragement and that phase, or, those feelings like, maybe Holland was a mistake, or maybe I'm failing at it or whatever. it was easier to hang on and not sink because I had this focus. Okay, well, I've got this next thing. We'll see. I've got this other thing to, and I talked to the director of my mission agency and talked to the leader in Holland. I remember the mission director saying, don't tell anyone that what you just told me. Don't tell people you feel that Peru is the next place you're going to live, just in case you go down there and you hate it and, you're embarrassed and whatever. So I was like, yeah, okay. But I've been here 10 years now, and I didn't anticipate coming down here, being here that long. For me, long term was like 3 years.
Right.
Short term is like 6 months or something.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah. So you've been there a while. How did you get into, because I know you help authors. You mentioned that earlier. How did you get into that?
Writing on my own.
Yeah. So you've written some books.
Yeah. Well, before going to Holland, I had started a blog. And in those days, it was after my mom had been healed of fibromyalgia. I think I told you when we talked the other day.
Yeah.
I won't go into that if you don't need me to. But long story made short, she got healed of fibromyalgia at a charismatic church outside of town. And I was encountering a lot of people who were just kind of like against it or trying to find reasons it didn't happen. So I had written a testimony email to a bunch of people, got some positive and some negative response. And I took that text and made like the first blog post. And for a while, I was just interested in trying to kind of persuade the reader about healing, and just charismatic things in general, but particularly healing. And that semester, I'd gone back to Fire, and we would go witnessing on the streets of Charlotte, uptown Charlotte, on Saturday nights. And we were just looking for people to heal, and I would go write the testimonies about it on my blog. And so this mixture of testimonies and defending, apologetics, and gradually shied away from that and wrote about more of a variety of things. But I've always been writing and putting thoughts out there and getting like a feedback loop going where I'm learning from my readers what they're latching onto, what they're benefiting from, what impact what I have to say is making. So a long time of doing this, goes by, and then in the 2007 or so, I started a podcast, and same thing. There's, writing is a lot different than sharing your thoughts in audio, but there's a lot of overlap, a lot of things that they complement. Well, one complements the other.
Yeah. And
so I'd been, podcasting and stuff, and I would just notice and pay attention to what was coming up all the time and what was working. And then from there, I put out my first book, and it was on healing. And then I did another one on faith, another one on, kind of discipleship and personal growth. But eventually I did one on speaking in tongues. And in both cases, with healing and tongues, it was like these topics where, having grown up Plymouth Brethren and knowing perceptions and, misconceptions, and then, going to a place like Fire and just changing my trajectory and becoming, more charismatic and stuff, I felt like I had this take on things that I could, put into a book, and it would work, for people looking for answers for some of these things. And so both books are this idea of lies people believe about this, that, and the other. So 6 lies people believe about divine healing, and 9 lies people believe about speaking in tongues. And the tongues one, eventually, I got approached by a publisher who wanted to re-release it, and thought with the right marketing and stuff, it could do really well. So, I gave into that and signed it over. But I'd keep writing, keep blogging, keep working on marketing my books. I've got like 7 unfinished manuscripts on the go on my own computer.
Wow.
But I would have people asking me for help with things all the time that I had done, whether their podcast, whether their books, Steve, can you help me format my book into ebook? Can you read my manuscript? What do you, I'd get people asking me. So that helped narrow and refine. Okay, so what can I do with this skill and talent? And so I kind of went down that road, but then it wasn't until maybe 2 years ago that I really decided to totally give it a shot. And I got like some business coaching and joined a really expensive mastermind and learned, like how to handle sales calls and how to present my offer and stuff like that. So I looked at it, and there's way more detail to it than perhaps is a good idea to share publicly. But long story made short, my wife and I were just in dire straits and in a situation, a bit of a crisis, where we didn't want to try to raise more support. We were just done with this mission system where you raise money and then you got to convince people you're producing fruit. You got to show, you got to be writing a newsletter every month. You got to be doing all these things to barely get by. You're overworked, but not making any donations or whatever.
So hard.
And when this particular crisis came our way, and we were kind of discussing it with our leaders, like, do we want to pack up and go to Canada and try to raise support to fix this? And I just said, no, I'm done. I can't do this. For me, it's like tent making or nothing. And if the tent making doesn't work, we'll give up and whatever, move to Canada, get a job or something. But if I'm going to tent make and use my skills and talents, then it's with writing. And so I just went about a lot of what I was learning from, my mentors and my coach, and how to attract clients to what you offer, and, how to handle prospecting, how to handle when you get them on a call with you and you're discussing whether you can do for them what you're offering,
right?
How to stick by your price and not be, like, this was a big thing, to be honest with you. And it might be a conversation, wealth and money and finances. And, you go from being broke as a missionary and barely getting by, and, the book sales help. They're great, when you're promoting them well. But like, to turn around, I had crowdfunding. I did crowdfunding for both my daughters' hospital, like their births. And so to go from like the kind of money I was needing to pay the hospital to like charging that kind of money to people to help them write their books and stuff, that required a lot of mindset help, and being around other people who, for them, it's nothing. And they charge 10 and 15K for consulting they do and stuff. To mention what I mentioned earlier about being around people who are on fire, there was that type of experience for me. They called it normalization. You get around people who are doing what you want to be doing, and then it helps bring you up to that level to do it. And so when I got through that, and I'm still going through it, I'm still, there's still mindset things to recalibrate. When I got through that, I don't know how to phrase it any differently than I already have, the mentality and not being afraid of charging, they call it charging what you're worth. If I'm going to do all this work for someone, then this is the amount I want for it. Not be guilt tripped because it's for the kingdom. That my price, my payment is eternal reward.
Right.
Yeah, but I got two daughters, and I've got rent and things today to pay for. So
right. My kids cannot eat a crown in the mythical future. Right. Whenever that is.
Yeah. So that's probably another podcast conversation.
It is, but we should have that one. I love that. So go ahead.
I would love to if you'll have me. I'm looking at the clock. I know I've taken up.
No, it's been fun, actually. I love it. Okay. So, Steve, people can find you at stevebremner.com.
Correct.
And so if you're an author, that's definitely check it out. Steve has some services. But if you're interested in his work and maybe, like we said earlier, some curious about your books, about some more charismatic ideas, maybe go check him out. So that would be good.
Yeah.
Steve,
those are all on Amazon, of course.
Perfect. Well. I've got links in the show notes at halfwaytherepodcast.com. Steve, anything you want to leave us with?
And this isn't, a theme or something we've discussed the whole time, but go for it. You know what I mean? Like, imperfect action is always better than no action at all, and God's telling you to do something, speaking something to you, pack it up to move or to write a book or to do whatever it is he's telling you to do. Just, go do it and not make excuses. You don't need to pray about something. If 10 seconds ago you told me God told you, and then you don't need to pray about it. You already know he's telling you to do something. Just do it, and not make excuses for it. And you don't regret when you go for it. So
100%. Hey, that's why we're both podcasters, right? Because we just went and did it, or authors. Absolutely. I agree with that. Steve, thanks for being here and sharing a little bit of your story. I appreciate it.
I appreciate you having me.